Hey everybody, I'm Shashank at Modular, and in this video we'll take a look at how you can use Mojo SDK with Docker containers. Docker containers are lightweight, consistent, portable environments which you can use to develop code, but also share it with others so they can reproduce your code and results in the exact same environment you use to develop the code. They're also popular in scaling code on large clusters using orchestration services such as Kubernetes, but in this video we'll specifically focus on how to set up your Docker container based Mojo development environment. To get started, head over to github.com/modularml/mojo where you'll find Docker files and other examples that we'll use to get started with our Docker container based development environment. Let's clone this repository, head over to our Linux based system where we want to set up our Docker container based development environment. I'll do git clone our repository. Once we cloned our repository, you'll see under the Mojo directory, there's an examples directory under which there's a Docker directory where you'll find a Dockerfile.mojo SDK. A Dockerfile is a set of instructions that you provide the Docker CLI tool so that it can build this virtual environment that includes all the packages that you would need in your development environment. In this case, this is an Ubuntu based container image that includes all these packages that we want to install, and also the modular CLI and Mojo, which is what we want to install. And finally, we also have Jupyter Lab, and we run the Jupyter Notebook service so that you can access your Jupyter environment from outside the Docker container. We also want to provide the authentication key in the Docker file so that the modular CLI tool can download and install Mojo. How do you find this authentication key? So you have to head over to developer.modular.com, and once you log in, you'll have access to the modular key here in the instructions. All you have to do is copy these instructions, head back, and there are a couple of different ways to provide this. One, you can simply update the Docker file here. You can paste it here, and then you can build the Docker file, and we'll come to how to do that in a moment. But a lot of users don't want to mess with Dockerfile, don't want to change it, and that's completely okay. Where you don't have to update the Docker file, but you can provide the authentication key as a command line argument using the Docker CLI tool. In which case, you would have to run a Docker command, which is docker build, and in the build argument, provide the authentication key here. So there are two different approaches to doing this. If you want to use the Visual Studio approach, which is a point and click approach, then you update the Docker file. If you want to use the Docker CLI tool, then you update it here. We'll keep things simple and we'll go and update it right here in the Docker file. So I update it and I close it. To build the Docker container, simply right click on the Docker file and choose build image. Once you do that, you can specify the name for the container. I'll choose a default, and then this will kick off the build process on my terminal. Now this will take a couple of minutes. I'll speed up this process in the video, but once it's finished building, you'll have an image that I'll show you in a moment that you can use to instantiate a container and run and set up your development environment. Now that the build process is complete, what we can do is head over to the Docker extension, and on the left side you should see that there is a Mojo SDK container image and the latest tag. You can also pull this up on the terminal by running docker images, and you'll see that there is a Docker container image right here. Now we want to instantiate the container, or in other words, run the container. Now the easiest way to do this is simply right click and say run the container, but we won't do this because all this will do is simply instantiate the container. We want to do a couple more things, which is to mount a volume on our host system, which includes all our code and examples that you want access to inside the container, so you can make changes to it, you can run, execute Mojo programs and build Mojo programs and so on. So to do that, what we'll do is run a script, docker run, and this will give access to not only the host volume but also gives access to the host network stack so that you can access all the services that you run inside the container, such as the Jupyter Lab service. So to do that, you have to run docker run -it says in interactive mode, which means you can see the output on the terminal. I minus v is volume mounting, so I want to mount the current working directory into a directory called workspace, and I want to give access to the host network stack so that I can access services running inside the container. I give it a name and then provide the image that I want to run, which is Mojo SDK colon latest. So to do that, I'll simply say /docker run, which will execute the script you see here. And when I hit enter, it's now executing the Docker container image. And if you see here, there's a URL that is http localhost 8888 lab. Let me go ahead and copy this and head back to our browser, open up a new terminal and paste this URL. And what you see is our Jupyter Lab client connected to the Jupyter Lab server running inside the container. You can also see that the workspace is mounted in our browser here. I'll zoom in, open up the workspace directly, Mojo, and you can see all the examples that we git cloned here. Okay, this is one way to interact with the Jupyter Lab server running inside the container image. You can of course go ahead and run these notebooks. But I'll show you a more interesting way to interact with it, which is through Visual Studio, because that's how a lot of us like to develop code. So let's go ahead and hide this terminal here, head over to the Docker extension, and on the top you should see that the Mojo container is running here under individual containers. So you can right click on it and say attach Visual Studio Code. Let me go ahead and click that. It'll ask you to ensure that the right container it wants to attach to. I click on that, and what this does is opens up a new Visual Studio window where it'll connect to the Docker container and set up an environment there. This will allow us to build applications in Visual Studio that's going to run in the environment inside the container which has Mojo SDK installed. That is pretty cool in my opinion, because if you recall, this specific Visual Studio client is running on my laptop on my MacBook here, and it's connected to the container that has Mojo SDK running on an Amazon EC2 instance. This makes remote development super easy and super convenient, and I don't need to install anything on the host system too. It's a portable container that I can develop on and share with others if I want them to reproduce my code. So I'm now inside the container environment, and to confirm that I do have access to Mojo, I'm going to cd into Mojo examples, and I have access to a bunch of Mojo examples here. So I say Mojo, let's say Mandelbrot, and I run it, and I see that I'm running the Mandelbrot code. I can also open up the Mojo REPL. Now I'm in the Mojo REPL here, :exit. So I have the full Mojo SDK development environment available to me inside this Docker container image. I can also use the container image to run Jupyter notebooks. So if I head over to notebooks, open up one of these notebooks here, you'll see that the kernel selection here automatically recognizes the Mojo kernel. So I can select the Mojo kernel and also execute Jupyter notebooks within the Visual Studio Code environment. There you go. So that was a quick guide to setting up a Docker-based development environment with Mojo SDK. Now, if you want to close this Docker-based environment, you simply close the Visual Studio Code window and head back, but this doesn't stop the container from executing. To stop that, you can right click and you have two options. You can stop the container from executing, or you can remove the container. So if you want to get back to the same container and continue your work, because all these changes are saved in the host volume, so I simply say stop, and this stops the container. And when you want to come back and resume development, you can right click and start the container, or you can completely remove it as well. If you remove it, then you'll need to run this docker run command again. And bear in mind, all your code changes are saved because it was in the host volume that was mounted into the container, ephemeral container. So all your changes are saved here. So that's it, folks. That's a quick walkthrough of using Docker container based Mojo development environment. I hope you found this video useful. Stay tuned for more guides and see you in the next one.